It was the first week of November, and a bitter wind pushed leaves like restless secrets down our street in a small college town where the streetlights hummed and the air tasted faintly of dryer sheets and old smoke. I was 28 then, working nights stocking shelves at a 24-hour grocery and sleeping through the afternoons, thinking the worst I had to worry about was a dead battery in my car or another late shift. That night, I had closed my register later than usual, waved at Mark the manager and Jenna the assistant as they locked up, and headed out to the empty parking lot under a single flickering streetlight. The lot looked different when no cars were around, vast and vulnerable, and as I crossed the silent asphalt, I noticed tracks in the thin mud by the curb that did not match my boots. I felt my stomach drop. Someone had been here after closing. I shrugged and told myself it was probably Kevin from the deli, who sometimes sat in his car for hours. I heard a faint metallic breathing noise from behind a pallet of crates, and then a voice, low and casual, said, "Do you still have the old lock cracker?" I froze, partly because the voice sounded like a neighbor I knew from work, and partly because it had come from a place no one should be standing. I answered without thinking, "I do, for the back door only." He laughed, a sound that scraped at the inside of my skull, and then he walked away. What happened after changed how I looked at late nights and empty parking lots forever. Do you ever get the feeling that someone stepped into your life not to meet you, but to test how easy it would be to walk right through you? This happened like this one quiet, flaring moment, and then unfolded into 5 nights I cannot forget and 5 stories I am still trying to understand. It started with a strange exchange in the parking lot that I will never be able to explain, and it kept getting worse. A few nights later, the first real sign of trouble came while I was walking home from a shift with a paper bag of cold food and a flashlight that was already going dim. I passed Mrs. Alvarez, who was on her porch with a thermos and a warm smile, the kind of neighbor you trust to bring soup if you were sick. I said good night, and she said, "Watch your back, love," and I half laughed and waved, thinking she meant the usual city caution. Then I saw them across the street by the lamppost, 2 figures standing too still, one in a hood and one holding what looked like an old camcorder. I told myself to keep walking, but the air tasted metallic, and there was a wet smell under the sodium light, like pennies and rain. I stopped, and the taller one turned his head just enough for me to see a mask tucked under his arm. I felt a pressure in my chest, like someone sitting heavy on it. I took out my phone to call Mark to tell him I was nearly home when the shorter one lifted a gloved hand as if in greeting. He mouthed, "Are you okay?" I heard the voice this time, a whisper, not through the phone. "Do you live on Elm?" I said yes, and in the same breath I added, "No, and why?" He said, "Because we like your lights and we want to come back later." I almost laughed at the absurd bravery of that sentence, and then a cold slammed into my knees. I walked faster, heart pounding, and when I turned at the corner, I thought I saw the hooded figure move behind a tree in perfect sync with me. A shadow practicing steps. What do you do when someone practices taking your life like a rehearsal for a show? I kept going without telling anyone. Later that week, I learned from Officer Ramirez that similar reports had come from 2 blocks over, and that a neighbor named Luis had installed a battery-operated trail camera after being woken at 2 in the morning by a scratching on his porch. The camera had caught nothing but a low hum of movement and an indistinct shadow. I did not tell the rest of what I saw because it felt too foolish to say, and because I wanted to be believed. The first big confrontation came one heavy November night when snowfall began thin and cruel, and the roads were glossed with ice. I had just finished a double shift and took the shortcut through the alley behind the laundromat to save 5 minutes. The alley is a corridor of smells, grease and lint, and cold iron, and that night it felt like a throat. As I rounded the dumpster, I saw a figure step out from behind the corrugated wall with a mask that looked like a skin stitched together from different faces. He smelled of oil and something floral, like a cheap aftershave trying too hard. My hands clenched on the paper bag of food, and I heard myself say, "Who are you?" He answered, "I am the one who notices you,"
with a voice that was both close and far away. Conversation suddenly became a strange bargaining chip between fear and time. I tried to back up, my boots scraping the grit, and he matched me foot for foot. I pulled out my phone, and its battery showed 20%, and I thought that would be enough to call 911, but the wind swallowed the sound of dialing. He tilted his head like a curious animal and whispered, "Why did you walk this alley?" I said, "Because it is faster." And "Stupid." And he laughed softly and said, "People like you always say that." Then a second man
stepped from the shadow, this one wearing a cap and with a camera dangling from his neck. He said, "We thought the night would be prettier with you in it." I asked, "What do you want?" And he answered with a slow smile, "We want you to feel watched." I will repeat the exchange because the memory is a knot I still pick at. I said, "Stop." He said, "Why?" I said, "Leave me alone." He said, "Not until you look at us." I said, "I do not want to see." He said, "Look." I looked, and at that moment a long, sharp sound like metal on metal split the air, and someone banged on the metal roll-up door of the laundromat, twice, 3 times, a staccato that matched my heartbeat. I ran then, without thinking, my arms burning with cold, feet slipping, the snow turning my breath into a visible trail. They followed, 20 steps behind, then 40, then a silence, like someone suddenly holding their breath. That chase felt both endless and very short, and it left me with a memory of a boot print beside mine that was deeper, as if the person beside me carried extra weight or extra intent. This was the first real chase, and ended when I threw the food bag over a fence and climbed a narrow iron railing, hands tearing, and dove into Mrs. Alvarez's yard. She woke and screamed and called 911, and for once her voice was a sharp light that cut through the haze. Officer Ramirez came within minutes with another patrol and a flashlight that made the snow angels of our footprints into pale ghosts. They combed the alley and the parking lot and found a camcorder lying in the snow with an hour of night footage of empty streets. The audio track had what sounded like whispering recorded under the wind. The investigators called it a prank and then a pattern. At the time, it felt like a relief, but the relief was thin. About 35% into this telling, I want to pause and reach out, because if you have ever felt like eyes were tracking your steps at night, you know that hollow cold. If you have a story like this, start your comment with "once" and say one line about where it happened. If you feel safer sharing privately, do it, but if you can, post a line. We can build a map of how many nights like this there are. While you think about that, I will keep going, because the story only widens, and there are people to name who helped and people who did not. After that night, I started to notice small things that tightened the pattern. Kevin from the deli texted me a photo of my backdoor latch from across the street with a caption, "You left this slightly open." Dana, my friend who works in the library, sent a voicemail of nothing but the sound of our building corridor and a soft click that sounded like a camera shutter. Sarah from my class came by one afternoon bringing soup and said her boyfriend, Mr. Holloway, saw someone standing in the hollow near the creek and that he could not explain why they had a small camcorder aimed toward the houses. I began to lose trust in silence. The second story I have to tell begins in a cabin my parents own upstate, where I drove on a weekend needing an excuse to breathe without watching over my shoulder. The backstory matters here because I grew up on a farm where you learn to leave porch lights on and never answer unknown knocks. My father taught me how to check a lock with a pin and a tiny mirror, and my mother insisted on always carrying a whistle. I studied journalism at a university where I learned how to parse truth and lies, which made me skeptical in ways that sometimes helped and sometimes left me frozen when action was needed. At 28, I had a job that kept me at night, and friends who were steady and sometimes boring in their comfort. I had lost my grandmother 2 years before, and that grief taught me a new bottom line about fear.
I did not leave the cabin that weekend to run away from anything except the city noise, but the silence there was different, full of undergrowth and distant trains, and something that sounded at times like a faint footstep on the deck. The cabin had one old wood-framed window in the living room that looked out on the thin line of trees, and a porch that creaked in a rhythm like a slow clock. I arrived Friday afternoon, unpacked, lit a lamp, and told myself for the 100th time that I would not let fear decide my plans. The second arc of nights involved the cabin and a man who began whispering my name against the glass. On the first night, a knock came at midnight, 3 slow knocks like a hesitant drum. I felt my heart skip. I called out, "Is anyone there?" And a voice on the other side said, "It is late. I just need a place to be warm." I did not open. We did this exchange as real people do when they try to be sensible in impossible situations. I said, "I cannot. The cabin is private." He said, "Please, I am cold." I said, "No." He said, "I will not hurt you." I said, "Then leave." He said, "You live alone." I said, "Yes." He said, "So you will answer." The final knock cracked a pane, and a line of spider-webbed glass glinted under the lamp where blood had smeared like paint. I called 911, and they came, but the man was gone, and the snow had covered the thin footprints leading away toward the road. That is the first of 3 tension moments.
I still replay. I remember the smell of wet wool and old paint that night, and the way my fingers left pale prints on the window, sealing the corner with a piece of tape. The police wrote up a report and left a little card with a number and a promise to patrol more often, but they also said there was no sign of forced entry, which made me feel both safer and more exposed because it left a hole in explanation. I moved some furniture against the window and slept in the center of the room with my phone on and the battery saver blinking like a heartbeat. The second unexpected escalation at the cabin came 2 nights later when someone left a small voice recorder on the front step playing a looped clip of my grandmother singing a lullaby. I recognized the tune and the crack in the voice because my grandmother had recorded it years ago. I felt nausea and a foolish rage because the man had known something about me that he should not have been able to know. I kept that little device in a shoebox and later handed it to Officer Ramirez, who told me he would log it for evidence. It felt like a token proof, but the proof was small, and the fear survived. One of the most unnerving episodes happened in the grocery where I worked, and it is the one that convinced me this was not random. I was alone the night they left the recorder on aisle 3, playing a clip of my own voice as I had spoken that afternoon, asking a customer in line if they wanted paper or plastic. Who would have a recording of me unless someone had been listening for days? At closing, I found a tiny piece of tape with the words "See You" under the register. I called Mark, and he came back to lock the door with me, and we had a series of exchanges that I will not forget. I said, "Someone has been messing with us." He said, "Show me." I said, "Look under the register." He said, "Who would do this?" I said, "I do not know." He said, "Did you call 911?" I said, "Not yet." He said, "We should." I said, "Maybe we should wait until morning." He said, "No, we will call now." We called, and the operator asked for details, and we gave them the tape and the recording and a name list, and then waited with flashlights and the smell of bleach in the air. The odd thing was that the store cameras had a blank hour that night, with no recordings from 2:12 to 2:47 a.m. When the footage resumed, it showed aisles empty and then a slow, deliberate walk past the bakery, as if someone wanted to check where the cameras were. The forensics team said they could not find an obvious tampering device, but they noted that someone had looped the camera feed at some point, which in lay terms meant someone had the technical skill to erase presence. That night, a group of 3 people in masks tried to force the back door, and the alarm screamed. I was in the office in the dark, and a figure banged on the glass in front of me, peering into the small rectangle as if to study my face. I felt like an animal under glass, and I remember yelling at them to go away. And the nearest thing to bravery I found was trying to speak normally so my voice would be a human sound, not a high whine. They said through the glass, "We have been waiting for you to finish your shift." The manager, Mark, opened the office door, and the lead of the group stepped back and said, "That is not what we wanted from him," and tossed something that exploded like a firework of paper, and then retreated. We called police, and the unit arrived, but the men were gone. The store closed for a week while measures were added, and while I felt safer during daylight, I knew the plan had been deliberate and dangerous. I have to name the people who threaded through these nights, because names anchor stories. Mark, the manager who stayed with me at closing, and who later pressed his own doorbell at 2 a.m. when he heard a faint knock. Jenna, who sent me thermos soup, and later a picture of a hooded figure near her car. Louis, the neighbor, who set up a trail camera, and who later kept a vigil outside my apartment with binoculars. Officer Ramirez, who believed me enough to add more patrols and to take the little recorder seriously. Dana, who brought flashlights and a string of old caution tape, and who once stood at the window with me and said, "Do you think they sleep?" Kevin, who was often in the deli and later found a mask under the dumpster and gave it to the police. Sarah, who came with her boyfriend Mr. Holloway to the cabin and who helped tape up the window after it was broken. These people each did something specific, and their reactions ranged from disbelief to fierce protection. I leaned on them in ways I had not anticipated, and it was their presence that prevented me from closing into terror. There were 3 moments of tension that still tighten my throat when I remember them, and each of them pulled a different thread. The first was the stair chase in the laundry yard, where the shadow kept perfect pace with me, and the sound of his breath was like a second voice. My muscles ached with the effort to get away, and a memory rose of a childhood game of hide-and-seek that turned sinister because the hiding place failed to hide me. The second was the glass cracking at the cabin and the smell of blood on the pane, which is an image that replays with a kind of slow horror because it is proof. The third was the moment in the store when something hit the office window, and I looked up into a face behind a mask that had 2 painted eyes and a stitched mouth. And I realized the person outside had been watching the security monitor just as I had been watching them. Each of these moments fills about the same space in my memory, and each lasted only seconds, but they threaded days and nights with dread, making the ordinary feel like a trap. The investigation was slow and mixed. Officer Ramirez filed reports and took the camcorder, the little recorder, the tape, and logged statements from Mark, Jenna, Kevin, Dana, and Louis. For a while, there were more patrols, and I slept at a safe house that Sarah arranged with her friend Cole. For a while, I ate soup and watched daytime TV and tried to pretend nothing had changed. A detective named Harper came by and asked the kind of formal questions that felt like a cold examination, but also like important steps. He asked, "Who would want to scare you?" And I said I did not know, and I realized then how complicated the motive could be between attention and power and something worse. The police found one man with a mask and a camera 2 towns over, but he denied involvement in our incidents, and his footage was too grainy to place him. The forensic team found fingerprints on the camcorder that did not match any of us at the store, and they logged them as unknown. There were threads that suggested a group had staged scenes to study reactions, as if we were experiments, and that they collected recordings to enjoy the echo of our panic. That possibility made my skin crawl in a way nothing else had. I began going to therapy twice a week because the nights brought vivid replay and a persistent startle at small noises. I also changed jobs for a while and installed extra locks and bought a battery-operated doorbell that records and emails if someone approaches. The little recorder from the cabin sat on my kitchen counter for weeks like a relic. 3 months later, the most concrete consequence arrived when Jenna found a package at her door with a Polaroid of me walking past the lamppost on a night shift with the timestamp and a note that said, "We remember you. We remember your face. We have been watching." We called Detective Harper, and he said the case was now part of a broader pattern across county lines and that other reports matched our timeline. The county issued an alert and asked people to report any odd recordings or missing footage. The men never came back to our immediate block, but the pattern of small intrusions continued in neighboring towns until a larger operation by a regional task force interrupted a ring that the investigators believed to be targeting night workers and isolated houses. 6 months later, some arrests were made in connection with similar incidents, and the prosecutor said they had enough to charge several people with stalking and tampering with surveillance equipment, though not every act could be tied by hard evidence. That gave a measure of closure, but not the feeling that everything was finished. 1 month after the first night, I could walk down the street without looking over my shoulder and make it to my porch without feeling like somebody kept time with my steps. 3 months after the worst events, I had a deposit of quiet in my chest and a cautious sense that I could trust myself again to go out after sunset. 6 months later, I moved to a different neighborhood, put up a new fence, and left the battery-operated doorbell at my old place with Officer Ramirez as evidence. I still have the recorder from the cabin in a drawer, and every so often I will take it out and replay the static and the lullaby, and I feel both the comfort of hearing my grandmother and the prick of being watched. My life shifted in ways both small and blunt. I take different routes. I text a friend when I walk home. I go to therapy. I second-guess smiles. I am more likely to lock my car twice before I get in. But I am also more ready to call for help and more willing to tell the full story without shame. I did not tell everything at first because parts of it sounded ridiculous and because I did not want to become the person who made her world smaller with fear. That is the real cost of these nights you do not see in reports. The stories linger like footprints in snow that melt but leave a line where something was. If you have lived through something like this, you know what it does to your sleep and to the way you walk past windows at night. If you have not, maybe you will listen to the small things your body tells you and not dismiss the tiny disturbances. I tell you these 5 nights because they became 5 stories that haunt my November, and because there are people who helped, and people who left signs, and people who likely never paid for what they did, but who taught me how to protect myself. For those still watching the shadows, remember this one line that I cannot shake, and that I say to myself when the wind makes the railing rattle outside my window: you are not a light to be stolen. If you want to hear more, and if you have a one-line story, start your comment with "once" and tell us where it happened and one thing you noticed so we can map these nights together. If you want to hear more detailed accounts and investigations, subscribe, and I will bring the full records and the names and the ways we tried to make sense of nights that do not make sense. Stay safe and check your locks twice, and sometimes 3 times, because the small mechanical acts may be what hold the line between a cold night and something worse.